We're glad you joined us for our 8:30 worship service, and I know several of you, it's your first time back following the pandemic that we canceled church a year ago and people getting their vaccine, so glad you are here worshiping with us. So if Herb believes I'm giving you an answer for raising teens, let's just go ahead and have the closing prayer, and we'll end it right now. We are continuing this series that we started last week, which is entitled Generation to Generation, and today's message is about the energy of youth. And it's dealing with teenagers and youth and often what is referred to today as Gen Z. Now, for me, this has been one of the more challenging sermons I've had to prepare in a long time. One reason it's challenging is because of my age. I'm 40 years removed from the Generation Z, and while we've some wonderful teens in our church, I don't obviously work with them specifically. Second, it is challenging for me because of the amount of material I found and the time of research it required. At first, when I started the message, I had very little material, and within 2 or 3 hours, I had so much, this could have become a whole series in and of itself. And then third, it's challenging because relating all of this in 30 minutes is going to be difficult. So I hope you brought your lunch with you today. The hope I have and the spirit in which I want to talk about the generation of teenagers is found in a book entitled Grace-Based Parenting by Dr. Tim Kimmel. He writes, "The teenage years are some of the most exciting years of parenting. When parents are fearful of this stage of their children's development, it causes the children to be reluctant to trust them or not turn to them when they're confused or to confide in them that they're carrying a heavy burden. This is also a time when parents should be putting on the finishing touches on their general, specific, relational, and spiritual purposes." Now, the same could be said of the church as we think about how we're going to minister to, include, and help develop the gifts of teenagers. We certainly should not see the teenage years as a burden or just a phase of life. The years of these ages of, let's say, 13 to 19 can be some of the most impressionable ones, and they are ones where values are developed, habits are established, and the spiritual path is being forged. Now, the Bible is sufficient for our spiritual growth, but there are times that I wish there were more detail in it, and one of those times would be about the teenage years of Jesus. We know about Jesus' birth, and we know that after he was age of 2, his parents took him back to his hometown of Nazareth because they had spent 2 years in Egypt protecting their son's life from King Herod. When Jesus was age 12, his parents took him to worship in Jerusalem as they did every year. And as they were heading back to Nazareth, Joseph thought Jesus was with his mother, Mary thought he was with Joseph, and the men would usually stay behind to break up camp, and then later they'd catch up with their families in the evening. But when Mary and Joseph met on that particular night, they discovered that Jesus was not with either of them, and that had to be terrifying to them. The Saturday before we moved into this sanctuary, back in June of 1997, several families met on Saturday morning to do some deep cleaning from all the construction dust. About 5 o'clock in the evening, we wrapped up. Barb, Adam, and I were the last ones to leave the building. And as I turned out the lights, I heard a little shrill voice quietly saying, "Mom, Dad, are you here?" And in the hallway, I found an 8-year-old wandering the hallway whose parents had left him here in the building. The parents had driven separately that morning because they had a little bit of different schedule, and Mom thought Dad had him, and Dad thought Mom had him, and both had left him here in the building. So we let him stay all night and protect the place for us for a while. Barb and I delivered him home, and they were fine. But they were relieved because when we got home, they both had just pulled in their driveway thinking neither one of us has our son. Oh, Mary and Joseph had to have been relieved when they found Jesus. He was in the temple courts listening and understanding what some of the religious leaders were teaching. But Luke then just bridges a gap of about 18 years from the time when Jesus was 12 until he was 30. And it's in one verse, in one sentence, in Luke 2, verse 52, "And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." The Bible indicates that when one is in this stage of life, there is a lot of potential for energy to be exerted. It is a time of learning, exploration, and challenges. Ecclesiastes 12:1 says, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, 'I find no pleasure in them.'" 1 Timothy 4:12 says, "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity." So for parents with younger children, maybe they're under the age of 12 or 13, I hope the sermon will help prepare you a little bit for passing through the corridor of the teenage years and then help to prepare your adolescence for adulthood. For those of you who've already maneuvered with teens through that time, I hope it'll help each of us to reflect and to see how we can do more to encourage teens in our own church. For those who have adolescents in your home right now, hopefully it can be a source of encouragement to you so that that young man or young woman in your home can transition into adulthood in a way that is distinctive and that it honors Jesus Christ. First, I want to recognize the challenges of the teen years. There are challenges with the teen years. The years of adolescence can be some of the most challenging physically. The body is undergoing changes, hormones are increasing. When I was around 14, I developed acne, and then after about a year or so, it went away, and I'd gone to a dermatologist, and the medication worked. But around 17 or 18, 3 or 4 years later, I developed a second phase of acne that was severe cystic acne, and due to its severity, I developed all kinds of scarring on my face and my neck and my shoulders. Teenagers began thinking about how they look. I had acne, braces, and more glasses, and eventually changed to contact lenses. And male and female both start styling their hair. They want to make an impression when others see them. It is challenging as you go through those years physically. And it is challenging emotionally. An adolescent can incorrectly interpret an expression or a comment from someone as being negative. The soccer coach is not overly smiling or happy, and it's interpreted to mean my coach may hate me. And it's during this stage of growth that our brains undergo the most massive remodeling and rewiring. Maybe as a child was younger, they obeyed immediately and without question, and then one day you give a command and suddenly it is questioned or there is doubt expressed, and that's because the thinking of the mind has changed and they just don't want to hear a command, they want rationale behind it. When I was probably 11 or 12, just before my teen years, my mother and I got into an argument, and she is standing in my bedroom facing down the hallway. My back is to the hallway, and we were having some words back and forth, and I didn't know it, but my dad had walked down the hallway and was standing just a few feet behind me. And I said something, and my mom and I were getting more intense with this disagreement, and I looked at her and I said, "You great big dummy." And all of a sudden, I felt a hand on my shoulder. And my dad picked me up, turned me around, raised me eye level, and he said, "Who's the big dummy?" I said, "I'm the big dummy. I'm the big dummy." The teen years can be challenging physically. They can be challenging emotionally. They can be challenging relationally. How does one relate to adults, peers, and those with whom you might have disagreements? And part of that relationship process is learning to remain pure. Paul wrote to young Timothy, "You be an example of purity." First cruise Barb and I took about 8 years ago, it was down to the Bahamas for a 3-day cruise. There were 400 teenage girls from Argentina on that cruise. Not that I noticed, but I heard that it looked like they threw on their bathing suits and missed. Some of you will catch that in a minute. One afternoon, Barb and I were sitting at the poolside, we're relaxing, we're reading. There was a couple there who had 3 boys with them. One was around 15 and the others were like 10 and 8. And the 15-year-old kept swimming to the other side of the pool where there were about 20 of those girls from Argentina sitting. And finally, I kept seeing the dad get up and going over there. And finally, I saw the dad get up, go over there, and he said, "Son," he said, "your family's on this side of the pool. This is where you're going to stay." You know, the challenge of a relationship and to keep it pure is intense during that phase of life. My mother worked at Hill's department store, and she was the manager for women's lingerie, which meant she often brought home catalogs of young girls in lingerie. Now, I was always tempted by that, but while the passions were the same as teenagers of today, I didn't have the availability and the intensity that they battle now. For me, it might have been a catalog. For some teenagers today, it could be internet pornography. And so Paul instructed Timothy, you be an example in purity and you be an example in speech. Profanity can be an issue because of the extreme exposure to it. It occurs in the locker room and on the sports field and in the hallways and on TV and at the movies and in some music. And some teenagers have to battle their exposure to bad language even in the home. And so the exposure and the need to impress one's peers can make it a real battle. So moms and dads, you have to be cautious of the language you're using. Do you sometimes allow a word of profanity to sneak in your speech? Do you sometimes post a meme that has the F word? It's become commonplace in our society. And the teen years can be challenging culturally. Have you noticed there has been a titanic shift in our culture in the last decade or so? And the idea of truth and absolutes, whether it is in beliefs or behavior, is often questioned. And I think it's affected teens for a couple of reasons. One is the need for acceptance has heightened an adherence to cultural values over biblical values. Everybody wants to be accepted. But one of the declining areas of our culture is spiritual truth and values. Now, there's some spirituality occurring, but sometimes it's not associated with the absolute truth of God's Word. 2 Peter 2:2 says, "Many will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrepute." Truth has become fluid. And it's what you want it to be and how you find it affecting you versus of being a guardrail for life or a parameter by which you try to live. Now, one thing I want to be very cautious to say is Gen Z is not to blame for this titanic shift. It is the generations ahead of them that have allowed it. I could spend all day giving you information, reading about the characteristics of Generation Z, but there are two characteristics that have greatly shaped today's teenagers that really popped out to me. One is teens often have a feeling of being overwhelmed today. Time editor Susanna Schorpsdorf, in her article, "The Kids Are Not All Right," interviewed numerous teenagers from all different kinds of backgrounds. She writes, "There's a pervasive sense that being a teenager today is a draining full-time job. That includes doing schoolwork, managing a social media identity, fretting about career, climate change, sexism, racism, and you name it." And she notes that 68% of teenagers feel overwhelmed by everything they need to do every week. And teens sometimes have a blurriness to life. Technology has blurred the lines between home and work, study and entertainment, the public and the private. And that leads me to a second effect on teens, and that is the easy accessibility to information. The easy accessibility to information. One of the terms used for Gen Z is digital natives. Digital natives. While millennials grew up in a technologically savvy and connected world, Gen Z cannot remember a world without the internet. They grew up swiping an iPad before they learned how to walk. They're the first full generation raised in the era of smartphones. Gen Z can be connected every waking hour of the day. And that digital connection is not necessarily bad, except that content on the internet can be generated by unsavory products and people running unsavory websites. I don't recommend a lot of books, but this is one I'd recommend for parents of children and teenagers, entitled 10 Tips for Parenting the Smartphone Generation. It's written by Gregory Jantz. Jantz writes, "My parents could control what I saw and heard when I was at home. Because they controlled the switches to the television and to the radio, they had the key to the front door. They control the access points into our family. Technology has created multiple access points for our kids, and we are the ones who have purchased those connections." Now, that easy connection to others can channel the energy of teenagers into areas that can potentially cause issues at home, at school, and even for future career opportunities. And this past year with the pandemic has heightened the use of digital connection even more. And while that has been a lifesaver in many ways, it has also pulled many of us away from one-on-one personal contact. And I'm fearful that the long-term effects of this pandemic are going to be more significant than the virus itself. Because we're not going to overcome this. It's not going to be an anniversary like it is a year this weekend and it's suddenly over. The results of this are going to linger for a decade or better, where we are going to have to deal with students that have struggled in school, with teenagers that have struggled with being totally disconnected with friends and social life, and the results of this pandemic, I believe, are going to be much worse than the virus itself. Now, I am not suggesting that teens need all the access to the digital world banned. They need it for education, they need it for research, they need it for finding jobs, they need it for working. I am suggesting, parents, that you be keenly aware. Parents, you pay for the smartphone, you track the smartphone. Now, I know some teens may not like that comment, feeling their privacy can be invaded. But in the long run, it's better for the parents to be aware of the searches that are being made. Proverbs 28:13 says, "Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy." You know, we're hearing a lot today about cancel culture. The idea of somebody being ostracized from social or professional circles because you have a different belief or a different practice. I messaged a friend, he happens to be a minister, he has 2 teenagers in his home, he has 3 children, the third one's younger. And I said, "What's your greatest challenge raising a teenager today?" He said, "I think how quickly biblical and Jesus-centered values are being deconstructed in our culture. We're moving further and more quickly away from Jesus as a society. I fear that the mixed messages they'll hear outside of our discipleship of them. I fear how quick we're labeling each other in this cancel culture. The biggest challenge in teaching them how to love people in our world without losing the foundation of their faith from a world that is running away from the things that we believe and value is hard." When I was about 15, I was about 3 months away from turning 16. And in Kentucky that day, and that time, you couldn't even get your learner's permit until you were 16. But one Saturday, my dad said, "Son, why don't you take my car and you drive over to your friend Jerry's house?" Now, remember, I didn't have a permit. I didn't have a license. Jerry lived about half a mile away. My dad said, "Now, here's what I want you to do. You can drive over to Jerry's and you can drive back, and only you're to be in the car. That's the only thing you're allowed to do." My dad gave me his car key ring, and it had all kinds of keys on it. And in his car, I hopped in, I drove off, and I went over to Jerry's. As Jerry and I were sitting there talking, and I think his mom fixed us something for lunch, and she had to go somewhere. And now it was just Jerry and me sitting there, nobody else there. I suggested we go for a little spin. Now, there was a gravel road by Jerry's house that made a rectangle. In fact, here is a Google satellite map of Jerry's house and the road. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see this house that's circled red. That's his house. You'll see the highlighted part. That was the road. And then down at the bottom where the X is, that's where I lost control of the car. Because the road you're seeing is actually paved on that satellite image, but it wasn't paved 30-some years ago. And so Jerry, we're driving around the road, he said, "How fast do you think you can get it going?" Well, you know, any teenager likes a good challenge. And I said, "Well, I don't know. We're probably driving 20, 25. He said, "You think you can hit 60 or 70 on this road?" Well, sure, I can hit 60 or 70 on this road. The problem was when you got to that curve right there, you couldn't do that curve at 60 or 70 miles an hour. And I lost control, spun it around, and ditched the car, and I ditched it hard. And we were totally stuck. There is no way I was walking the half-mile home and telling my dad, "I just got your car stuck in a ditch because I was doing 60 or 70 miles an hour on a gravel road." Now, the houses you see in that photo, they all weren't there at that time. There was only a couple of them. But we went to a couple of houses, got a couple of guys. They came and they helped us push out the car. And then I took Jerry back to his house, and guess what we did? We washed my dad's car. We got the dirt off as much as we could. I drove home, but something else had happened during that little accident that I did not notice. When my dad gave me the keys, there were 2 key rings that were attached together. One ring had his house and his personal keys on it. The other one had a whole bunch of his work keys on it. And somewhere in the excitement of mine and Jerry's little incident, the key rings with all the work keys came off. And I handed my dad his key ring with the keys on it, but it didn't have the work keys. A few minutes later, my dad comes down the hallway. I'm in my room, and he says, "Where are my work keys on the other key ring, and why is the underside of my car so muddy?" He had gone to his car first to see if the other keys were maybe in the front seat, and then he happened to look. There was still some mud on the side of the car, and he looked down. There's all kinds of mud underneath the car, and he practiced cancel culture on me. He canceled the opportunity for my getting my license at age 16. He said, "You will wait 3 more months before you can go and get your license." I was eligible on February 1st, but I wasn't allowed to get my license and permit until May the 1st. I concealed my sin. I did not prosper very well. So, in honor of all the things that's going on this week, I wrote this little poem. You'll love it. My dad invented the cancel culture. Oh, yes, he did. He believed that the sins in a teen's life must soon be rid. He might even been a tad old-fashioned and sometimes even thought stern. He wasn't past putting a mark on the backside and making it burn. He believed if your action was wrong and your own horn you tried to toot, he wasn't beyond the response of giving you the boot. While under the roof you lived and you wanted to be daring and brave, he felt he should still call the shots and make you behave. Oh, yes, my dad canceled my culture more than just a time. I'm trying to get you to understand this silly little rhyme. I disobeyed and crashed the car into the ditch. He made sure later that I had a get-along in my hitch. For when he told my mother, she thought it should not be my niche. For when she got riled, man, she could sure throw a mean pitch. I know there are individuals and groups who say they started cancel culture and they boast, but that's not true, you see. If there were a show about it, my dad could have been the host. Please know my dad was good and he did not abuse, but one thing he did not allow was a teenage son to get too loose. Well, teens, listen, and I mean with all my heart, you have a great opportunity in this world to do your part. The future can look bleak or it can look great. I think you can take all of this mess and make it straight. It's weird when the preacher breaks into a poem and panders its use, but we've got some now in our cancel culture. Well, my goodness, they're even wanting to cancel Dr. Seuss. It's just one of many of what's going to be the latest craze, but Gen Z, you can fire up this world and set it ablaze. So be careful on what bandwagon you ride and you think you can afford, because the only one that will matter is the truth of this word. Okay, it wasn't that great, but hey, you got it anyway. That's a freebie, okay? Here's one other thing about the teen years. It can be challenging spiritually. We have a lot of teens in our church who are close to God and trying diligently to obey God in their lives. We have a huge number of children in our church who are going to cross into the teen years in the next 3 to 5 years. I read earlier where the Apostle Paul wrote, do not let anyone look down on you, but you set an example. And one of the words he says is, you set an example of faith. I thought of a great example of faith in the Bible of a teenager. It's David. David, who became the king. David, who had several older brothers who were on the battlefield and in the army at that time, and his dad said, why don't you take the lunch down to your brothers, which means he had to be in the teenage years because you had to be 20 years of old to be in the military at that time. David was not yet old enough. His older brothers were on the battlefield against the Philistines. No one had specifically been able to stand against a man named Goliath, a giant, and most Bible scholars speculate that David was around 15 when the battle occurred. And so the adults and an army of men learned their faith on that day from a teenager. 1 Samuel 17:37, and this is David speaking. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So David stated his faith in God, and then he showed his faith in God by saying, I believe there's enough power of God to defeat this giant. Recognize the challenge of the teen years, but secondly, respect the uniqueness of a teenager. Respect their uniqueness of a teenager. As we think biblically about each generation in our church over these next few weeks, there needs to be common ground and understanding for all generations. Some of you will remember Larry and Marilyn Schroyer. They both died in 2017, just a couple months apart from one another. They were such a great example of bridging a gap between generations. Teens in our church would flock to them, and Larry and Marilyn loved young people in this church. The Schroyers saw many changes occur in this world in their 80-plus years of living. They saw many changes of methodology within the church, but they knew the importance of ministering to and with youth. Now, here are some ways that parents can show respect to their teens, and the church can as well. Number one, accept the giftedness of each teenager. Accept the giftedness of each teenager. Sometimes as parents, we can force our plans and ideas on teens who are not gifted in those areas, or we want to see our children maybe succeed in areas where we did not. The father who wants his son to be a super athlete on the football field, or the mother who wants her daughter to be the greatest model ever, or the parents who want their teen to learn how to just be rich and make money and be wealthy. But don't be shocked at parents who want their children to follow a certain path. It happened in the Bible. The mother of James and John, although she's not named, wanted her sons to sit at either side of Jesus in eternity. She said, now, Lord, I don't want much, but if my two sons could just sit next to you, one on the left side and one on the right, I'd be a very happy mother. That's a big request. But moms and dads, you encourage the giftedness of each of your children, not the talents you wish they had or you wish they would develop. Our son decided not to enter vocational ministry. Now, he has preached for me on occasions, a few times. He does a good job. But in a conversation we had years ago, I inquired of Adam if there were some reasons he didn't want to go into vocational ministry. And he said, Dad, I really like the preaching part. He said, I like writing the sermon. I like preaching the sermon. He said, it's the other stuff I can't deal with. The pastoral care, the administration, the people issues, the meetings. I tell people, I don't get paid to preach. I preach because I enjoy it. I get paid to do all the other aspects of ministry. Greg Johnson and Mark Yorkie, in a little book, Faithful Parents, Faithful Kids, writes, boys and girls can be compliant or headstrong, easygoing or a handful. They can be artistic or math-minded, competitive or casual, sloppy or compulsive cleaners. A parent's responsibility is to round off the edges of the less desired traits and encourage the development of good attributes. Help your teens find their areas of giftedness as they prepare to become an adult and make plans for their occupation. And their area of giftedness may be much different than yours. So be cautious of pushing your teen in the wrong direction. Number 2, bond with your teenager, but realize the need to gradually release. Bond with your teenager, but realize the need to gradually release. The uniqueness of each teenager will determine as to the speed that release should occur. There are circumstances of maturity and temperaments vary. Parents need to pray for the wisdom to recognize the proper time to release their teenagers from some of the guidelines at home, and you just have to trust that you've instilled the right attitude and the right motives and the right behavior into them. Some parents will be tested more by certain teenagers. Your teen may have a bit of a rebellious streak, or maybe your teenager just has a humorous bent about them, and they're funny and they're enjoyable to be around. Dave Stone and his brother Jeff Stone are both preachers in our Brotherhood of Churches. Their father, Sam Stone, was editor for many, many years of a long-time running magazine called Christian Standard. In fact, Sam Stone died just a few weeks ago in his mid-80s. But when Dave and his brother Jeff were teenagers, being only a couple of years apart, they sometimes would take a little bit of advantage of their dad being a preacher and his being just a little bit naive. So in the 1970s and 80s, how many of you remember roll call cards in church? Anybody remember those? They were in the backs of the pews, and you'd take them out, and you'd fill out your name, and you'd put them in the offering plate. And if you were a member or an attendee or a guest, and then a lot of times in those days, the preacher at the end of the service would have like a head usher would come up to him, and they would give you the cards of the guests, and you would read the name of the guest and have them stand and recognize visitors. Now, we don't do that today because people don't like that, but back in those days, that's how it was done. And so Jeff and Dave decided to take a little bit of advantage of their dad being just a little bit naive at times. Now, their dad, Sam Stone, was a great preacher, was a big proponent of that kind of approach in recognizing visitors and guests, but they would write in names on roll call cards that their dad did not know. And he would stand up to recognize these names. For example, Jeff Stone said, we wrote in the name Peter Frampton one time. And he said, my dad's standing up there and he goes, Mr. Peter Frampton's a guest. Would you please stand here at church today? Oh, he must have left early today. I don't see him standing. Miss Alice Cooper, Mrs. Alice Cooper, are you here today? Now, some of you older people are catching. The teenagers are going, what's he talking about? I don't even know what he's talking about. And they're going, oh, she must have left early today too. Jeff Stone said, my dad finally, after a couple weeks of that, wised up to what we were doing. He said, we spent like the next 5 or 6 Sunday afternoons scraping gum off the bottom of the pews in the sanctuary. But parents, you build a strong foundation with your teenagers so there can be open communication and trust, and when something negative does occur to them, they're willing to come to you. Now, part of that bonding is you allow them to suffer the consequences of their decisions. Proverbs 13:24 says, a refusal to correct is a refusal to love. Love your children by disciplining them. So be wise enough to release your teens into the consequences so the experience will not recur. Sometimes a show of love is allowing the punishment needed to go on. It's reinforcing your love by affirmation of their doing right and acknowledging it. Now, we have some great teens in our church. We've had some here in the last couple of years who have gone on to college and jobs. There's one that stands out to me just because he was working for us for a while. When Jacob Giro was working for us here on our janitorial crew, I would see him in the hallway, and he was always so polite. And he would literally move over out of the way and stand at almost attention just to let me pass. None of the other staff do that. But Jacob would, move out of my way, Paul, you're in my way, get out of my way. Jacob would literally move out of the way and just stand there so polite. Good morning, Mr. Snotty. Very nice to see you today, Mr. Snotty. I'd say, Jacob, it's okay. You could actually call me Paul. You don't have to call me Mr. Snotty. He goes, no, I can't, Mr. Snotty. I'm not allowed to, Mr. Snotty. My mom and dad say I have to show respect. I said, it's okay. When your parents aren't here and you're here in the building cleaning, they aren't going to know. I'm not going to tell them. I said, it's okay if you call me Paul. Well, I'll remember that the next time, Mr. Snotty. Thank you so much. Now, I love that kind of show of respect. But what's really interesting is that didn't occur when his parents were there, but when he was away from them. They had instructed and molded and encouraged and then trusted he'd be released with the right kind of values. Or one other way parents and the church can show respect for teenagers: create a safe environment for honesty where faith can grow. Create a safe environment for honesty where faith can grow. Colossians 3:21 says, fathers, do not embitter your children or they'll become discouraged. Now that command of do not embitter, that can be not just to dads, that can be to every adult. Teens need to know they can go to their parents with their struggles, that there should be some in the church who accept them and love them. They don't need overreaction. They don't need written off because of a bad decision, a question, a doubt they may have invading their hearts. And for a parent and a youth sponsor, it may just be sitting and listening to a teenager who's voicing her doubts about her faith. Even if you as an adult can't adequately respond to those doubts, you lovingly listen and you embrace the struggle. Ted Tripp, in his book, Shepherding a Child's Heart, writes, encourage your teenagers not to run from their questions. Everyone does not have to answer every question, but everyone must find resolutions for the questions he has. Christian faith is robust enough to stand close scrutiny. You'll sometimes have to help teens find answers to problems you've never found difficult. Above all, don't panic during these times. Walk through them with your kids, entrusting them in your training and their salvation to Almighty God. Those doubts and questions, often they can be answered by scriptures. Maybe it's a command, maybe it's an example, maybe it's a principle. But that's not the best way teenagers are going to learn from Scripture. The best way they're going to learn from it is seeing you living it out among them. Their parents, their friends, the people here at church. The Native Americans of Michigan were the state's first highway route engineers. With very few exceptions, Michigan's major highways follow the trails they cut through the wilderness hundreds of years ago. A trail was normally 12 to 18 inches wide, and the people just followed in single file. But later, pack horses followed the trails, and that caused the trails to be widened. And then came wagons, and the trails became dirt roads. And then eventually the dirt roads became their highways. Our physical and spiritual children watch the path we're taking. The generations below us either see the clarity of the trail we are taking, or they may see us detour sometimes off the path. And to close this morning, as Herb already did as well, I want all the parents of teenagers and any teenagers here, 13 to 19, I'm just using the teen years, the 13 to the 19 range. Would you stand, parents and teenagers, parents of teenagers in the home and teenagers? I know there are some here. Would you stand this morning? And I want you just to remain standing, and we're going to have a prayer for you guys. Let's bow our head for prayer this morning. Father, the years of being a teenager can be awkward, sometimes as much for the parents as the teens. A teenager can bring so much joy and laughter and relief into the home, but we know at times there can be challenges and even hurts that need to be navigated. And so, God, I pray specifically for teenagers today who need to open their hearts to you, but I pray for the parents who need to open their hearts and their ears to their teenagers. You used David to show us what faith is, not just by his words, but by his actions. And I pray teenagers in this church would show those of us in older generations how powerful faith can still really be. I know your word tells us it will not return void. So I ask that you would empower us with what's been shared here today, and that maybe in someone's life today it would be a nugget of gold for a parent or a teenager, that it might change somebody's spiritual trajectory just so they could see you a whole lot better. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.